We can never actually prove a theory. We can rule out theories.
In 2015, Gen Z was using smartphones, social media, especially Instagram, front-facing camera, and their mental health collapsed.
We are more plugged into the 50 people that we listen to on our phone than the people in this room.
We cannot end wars because basically we have the bullies of the world, excuse me, the UK, US, France, China, saying no to whatever crime they're committing.
How do you deal with the problems of quantum mechanics? It has this blatant contradiction in it. It's not just a subtlety, it's blatant.
Gender is likened to a nuclear catastrophe or full-blown demonic power, then it is the fear of destruction.
I have a dog. The following is a true claim. Quote, I have a dog. I just said the same thing.
Thing is, we need to commit to long-term relationship. But again, long-term relationships, they're not necessarily romantic relationships.
I'm trying to take a global perspective on what's happening to people who are on the front lines of the climate crisis because they are sort of absorbing the externalities of our lifestyle.
We want to be free. And if you just do what's rational, if you just do what's moral, what use are you? You could be replaced by an algorithm. To truly assert your independence, your autonomy, you have to rebel against these things.
And so what we're doing in physics is we're building on layers of things that we know to be true in a regime. Now, we should be clear, we can never actually prove a theory, we can rule out theories. But when we say some theory is right, it means that it's been tested, it has consistent laws, it's been tested in many ways, it predicts more things than there are parameters. Now, since it was raised, why don't I think consciousness is part of it? Because actually, I think I have a smaller ego than most of my colleagues. I really don't think humanity is part of the ultimate description of reality. I think we're a lucky accident. I think there are many things that follow from the laws of physics that get us here, that get us to consciousness, none of which we understand, by the way, at this point. So I would hope that with a true theory of nature, and this is indeed one of the problems when we just say things like theory of everything. So personally, I never say it, but even if we did say it, we just mean that some fundamental laws are known. That does not mean that we know all the consequences of those laws. We can say we know the laws of physics and still not be able to describe ocean waves very accurately in certain ways. We have to work out, that's another kind of physics, to work out these things. And when we get to systems where there's a lot of feedback, it gets much harder. So as physicists, as particle physicists, we're trying to find ultimate laws, that is to say laws of very simple things, but then following that, we want to work out the complex consequences, which ultimately might include life, but that's not the same thing, and it doesn't mean one is true and one is not true. So I think if we just stop using the word truth and we start using the word effective theory, we'll be much closer to what we're actually talking about.
I pretty much disagree with everything that was just said. Truth is the phrase people often use the truth with a capital T. Truth is actually a rather uninteresting notion. It's not a profound notion at all. Very trivial notion. I have a dog. The following is a true claim. Quote, I have a dog. I just said the same thing. There's nothing more to saying that the things that can be true or not true are propositions. They're true if what they say is the case, and they're not true if what they say isn't the case. Period, end of story. There's not a big T, little t. And so am I after the truth? That's just asking, am I interested in how things really are? Yeah, I am. I'm curious, right? I'm really curious about the world. Now, what we know here, I just want to say directly, no, Newton's theory is not true. It never was true. It's wrong. Newton's theory of gravity is wrong. It made the wrong predictions. It got the advance of the perihelion of Mercury wrong. The fundamental concepts it's used are wrong. Maybe general relativity is closer. I don't know. Probably not. I have no problem saying that these theories, I mean, there can be theories that we know this from the history of science. There can be theories that we know are incorrect. But nonetheless, for practical purposes, they're fine. As you say, you want to send a rocket to Mars, you can use Newtonian gravity because the errors are going to be so small. Doesn't matter. Doesn't mean the theory is true.
What aspect of general relativity is wrong in your mind?
Oh, it's not wrong. Oh.
Or incomplete. So David Deutsch thinks about the incompleteness of GR, and you're thinking about the incompleteness of QM.
It's not claiming to talk about particle physics, for example. I don't think it is. Maybe some people try and do that. Yeah, it's wrong in the sense that it has to be combined with quantum mechanics. People say it has to be quantized, but I think that is the wrongness, because it's the only time we really need to do quantum gravity, in my view, is inside black holes. And what good does it do us? Suppose you have a theory to say what happens inside a black hole. Doesn't do any good at all. I mean, you might have a theory which extends, you could treat the infinite curvatures that would otherwise by infinite, say, no, it's really the new theory which comes in there. So what? Those are all hidden in the black holes. They don't influence what we do outside. Okay, it would be great to do it, but not so important as the other side of the story, which to me is the really important side, is how do you deal with the problems of quantum mechanics? It has this blatant contradiction in it. It's not just a subtlety, it's blatant. You follow the Schrödinger equation, you don't get the right answer. You have to collapse the wave function to get the right answer. Collapsing the wave function is in contradiction with the Schrödinger equation or with unitary evolution. It's a blatant contradiction, but people sort of stare at it, and it's so blatant that they just sort of argue it away. I don't know. Or they use wrong arguments to argue it away. My argument is that quantum mechanics is not quite right. And it's not quite right when it comes to gravity. And the collapse of a wave function is a gravitational phenomenon, and you have to glue up quantum mechanics right with gravity, mainly on that side, on the fixing quantum mechanics side, not on the fixing general relativity. Fixing, sure, you'd fix the other two, but that's only in problems with black holes and things. It's not in your face, whereas the other one is in your face. Fix that problem. That's the collapse of the wave function problem.
Whether we end up with a satisfying scientific theory of consciousness or not, or a satisfying test, I think an important issue is humans will attribute consciousness if we have an entity that displays a lot of the human-like properties that we associate with consciousness, and then that has consequences. That has social consequences. We may be tempted, once enough people think that some machines have consciousness, to give them moral rights. And I think that is a very dangerous proposition. We could end up with machines that we consider like, our peers, and give them, even design them so that they have their own self-preservation goals, just like every living thing has. And that would be dangerous for humanity. If there are machines that are smarter than us, and in the future, obviously, and that have their own self-preservation goal, then humanity is in danger.
The parallel, of course, is, currently we're talking about computers, but if we switch examples, the moral implications become very evident. For example, if we think about animals, right? The moment we start to see signs of consciousness in animals, and if you think about it for a certain amount of time, the sort of moral responsibility you feel towards these organisms changes quite substantially. And I think that's what you're saying here, isn't it, Yoshua?
Yeah. This comes back around to the hard problem and what feelings are, and the morality as far as animals are concerned is how much pain and suffering do we cause? And we have no way of knowing. We can see it in the eyes of animals that they appear to be suffering. Are they really? Who could say? Now, the other way around, I would say they definitely are, for clarity. But the other way around, probably a lot of people in this room would have seen Ex Machina, and this ambiguity at the end, how much is she simply using him to get her ends, how much is she emotionally engaged in any of it, is really, really deeply ambiguous, beautifully done. And I can imagine at least that AI is probably there already for all I know, perfectly capable of manipulating us emotionally without necessarily having any feelings behind it. So the morality boils down to the feelings, and we have no way of quantifying them or measuring them.
We made this mistake for a period in Iraq. We finally got it right during the surge. There should be a commitment to making life of the Palestinian people in Gaza much better. Start by getting Hamas out of their lives. Then you secure them, create gated communities, as we did in Fallujah, Ramadi, Bakuba, Mosul, and these other locations during the surge. You keep Hamas out, you have biometric ID cards, you flood the areas with humanitarian assistance, restore basic services, rebuild the damaged infrastructure, homes, and everything else, make life better. But in the meantime, there has to be a security force on the ground. If in the absence of a security force, and I understand why Israelis don't want to reoccupy Gaza and why America doesn't want them to occupy Gaza, but having done this stuff for a living, for 7 or 8 years of my final 10 or so, there is no alternative to them actually providing the security. Over time, you might work with the clans, you might work with local authorities and so forth, ensuring that they don't have Hamas sympathies. But that's necessary in the short term. I'm interested in the
beyond
long
the
term.
details of the strategic plan, the UN's top court now, the International Court of Justice, have issued a quite dramatic ruling. It said that Israel has to immediately halt its military offensive in Rafah. If Israel doesn't comply with that, should the United States continue to supply Israel with military and intelligence aid, or should it just say?
By the way, because you have to destroy Hamas. The problem is
ignore
how you go about do it. You have to
the
go
international
about.
Courts.
They have to do what they have to do
Why?
to destroy Hamas. Because Hamas cannot come back. Says me, says Bibi Netanyahu.
So
You're asking me questions. Let me answer them.
I know, but why is it okay to ignore the decisions by international courts?
Because Israel's imperative, but the difference, I'll explain, Israel's imperative is to destroy Hamas, but how you do that matters. You have to keep innocent civilian life lost to an absolute minimum. You have to carry out operations in a way that limit the damage to civilian infrastructure.
But they're not doing that.
We had a sign on the wall. They are doing it more so in Rafah than they have so far. So let's see how this plays out.
I'm a little bit surprised at the ease at which you say, well, Israel has to do what it has to do. It can ignore the International Court of Justice. At the same time, the United States and the European community and other sort of Western powers and allies attribute to Russia various kind of crimes of war and ask it to be held accountable. Isn't the West in danger of having these double standards when it comes to our enemies and our allies? When it comes to our enemies, the rules of law have to be followed and we need to hold people accountable. When it comes to our allies, they have to do what they have to do, and we'll help them, and they should try and do as much as they can, but ultimately we'll always be on their side. Isn't that double standards?
First of all, I don't agree with the moral equivalence at all. This is the same as the moral equivalence between the leaders of Hamas and the leaders of Israel. I just reject that. Number two, I do share concern over innocent loss of civilian life. If you looked at what we did during the surge in Iraq or in Afghanistan, we absolutely observed the Geneva Convention and the laws of land warfare. So again, I do believe there should be greater focus on that, without question. I've said that publicly since the very beginning. Use of large ordnance in urban areas, again, you've really got to look at the military necessity of that versus what is going to happen on the ground and the price that's going to be paid.
For me, we have already an international structure, and it's an international structure that is very, very faulty. We have a Security Council with veto powers. This is what has created the world that we have today. That we cannot end wars because basically we have the bullies of the world, the UK, US, France, China, saying no to whatever crime they're committing. So therefore we need to dismantle that because the majority of the countries in the world want peace. So we need to really change that structure and build that alliance.
I think the whole question of the United Nations should be discussed very seriously. How effective is it? Is the Security Council a democratic body or simply a leftover from the Second World War? who could be new members of the Security Council? Should the Security Council have veto power? Should the General Assembly be given more powers? And if not, that the United Nations is powerless unless all the 5 members agree, has made it quite useless in these crises on the Ukraine and in Israel-Palestine. And so the question has to be posed, would it be better to consider that different continental countries in the different continents have some new form of international body which reflects their continent in the broadest possible sense? India, which is very hostile to China, is very pro-Russian. I mean, if you look at the Indian press, the coverage of the Ukraine is very, very pro-Russian.
And has been historically.
And has been historically, but even in its new state. And what the Indian press, to give you one example, is calling for in the Ukraine seems to me to be eminently sensible, that there is no way out of this conflict except through a negotiated settlement by the West, NATO on the one side, and Putin on the other.
I couldn't disagree more with what Tariq said when he suggested that we resolve Ukraine by the West and NATO negotiating with Putin. Yeah. You know, the last time that happened was the Munich crisis in 1938, when the future of Czechoslovakia was decided by Chamberlain and the French with Hitler, but without the Czechs being invited to their own funeral. And the idea that Ukraine, which has been fighting superbly for its survival as a nation, should abandon its right to be the prime negotiator as to what concessions need to be made. And I make one additional point. It's all very well people saying we have to have a negotiated solution. The negotiated solution doesn't mean surrender. It means that both sides are prepared to make meaningful compromises.
Yes.
And on territory, not just on speeches.
Yes.
Now, if Ukraine is to be expected, as it may be at some stage, to acknowledge that it cannot expect to get Crimea back in the short to medium term, it might have to concede that some of the territory that Russia currently occupies may remain with Russia. That is not the basis of a negotiation unless Putin is prepared to withdraw his forces from large parts of the territory that he has occupied. And people like Tariq never acknowledge the second half of that statement, but they should.
Palestinians, even in the West Bank, did not majoritarily support Hamas. There just haven't been elections in these territories, which of course has suited Netanyahu because he has used Hamas as a bogeyman to justify never having to engage in peace negotiations with the Palestinians. Because again, as much as there are attempts to make this the two sides thing, there's actually one overwhelming colonial power and there is one occupied, colonized people, and they are not the same. They don't have the same reach in terms of the narrative, and they don't have the same reach over each other's lives. You talked about the Hamas Charter, laying out this genocidal vision. We don't need to be speculative when we talk about Israel's genocidal vision. It's happening right now. And for you to discuss a hypothetical generic, genocide that is not happening at a time when an actual genocide is ongoing is frankly distasteful and, in my opinion, disgraceful. There are now plenty of polls that show that it's not just a fringe within Israeli society. I wish I could tell you it was. I lived in Jerusalem, I lived in the occupied territories. The situation has got worse. Are there Israeli peace builders? Abso-freaking-lutely, and thank God for those people.
Now, I don't know to what extent IDF soldiers fighting in the Gaza Strip for almost 8 months now have seen before them clearly civilians, say children, and decided to just kill them at will, okay? I don't know of any such evidence to that effect, but I can quite easily assume that there were cases in which, many cases perhaps, that the IDF soldiers should have been much more discriminated in terms of what they are doing violently. For example, there were 3 hostages that managed to release themselves from captivity by Hamas, okay? And they were completely naked. They virtually nothing on them. And they waved a white fabric above their heads. They were killed by the IDF, okay? That thought that they were Palestinians. I think that that's a good enough indication that things like that have happened. It is not an institutional policy. But as Myriam was alluded to, yes, there were many cases by the horrible government that we now have that have referred to the Palestinians as if, there are no innocent Palestinians, and all of them support Hamas, and we should do away with all of them, which is horrible. But again, I think it's wrong factually. I think it's wrong morally to simply see that aspect of it, which is true, and ignore the other part of it, which is also true. That's things like that we have seen. This sort of dehumanization is things that we have seen among Hamas and not just Hamas, vis-a-vis Israelis.
It is absolutely vital to start preparing for it. So the beginning is absolutely urgent. But just like Steve, I don't think it is possible politically and from other points of view to reduce fossil fuel consumption by a huge amount unless and until we develop better alternatives. And for that, we need to start the investment process right away, but also recognize that we probably will overshoot 1.5. And I think the costs of doing so could be quite major, absolutely. On the other hand, I don't think they are existential, meaning that I think we can have really huge costs with some noticeable loss of life. But humanity will adapt. It's just that adaptation is extremely costly. It's hugely costly. We wouldn't want that adaptation. And in particular, in the less developed parts of the world, that adaptation is almost impossible. So just denying that these problems are going to be real is not conducive. But I think from a realism point of view, I also don't think that this is going to be a humanity-ending crisis. But we have to take urgent action, and the urgent action has to be guided towards developing better technologies in order to be able to completely phase out fossil fuels. So that's the objective, and I think it's doable, but I think it's going to take much more work.
I think crisis is a luxury belief. I think most of the world, 6 billion people who are coming up the development curve, would look at you and say, what are you talking about? My crisis is my daily existence. I do not have enough energy for heat, light, refrigeration, mobility. And I need to take care of that first. And the best way to take care of that is by fossil fuels at the moment. I agree with Daron that, in fact, technology is a solution. I believe nuclear will, in the end, be the way we reduce emissions. Wind and solar have real issues. We can talk about that. But by and large, most of the world, and the voice missing in this discussion, are the people who use a fraction of the energy that the people in the US or Europe use.
I mean, I think that crisis is not a luxury belief. I mean, I'm not in crisis out here on Long Island at all. I think the people who are in crisis are the people in Pakistan who are probably still homeless after the flood of 2021, or the people in the Sahel region who haven't been able to grow crops properly for, almost 7 years now because their hydrological cycle is so out of whack. I mean, the fact that I am sitting here talking about crisis doesn't mean I own the term. It means that I'm trying to take a global perspective on what's happening to people who are on the front lines of the climate crisis because they are sort of absorbing the externalities of our lifestyle through no fault of their own. I know full well that most people live on, $6.85 a day and emit almost no carbon at all. And they absolutely need energy, but it is absolutely ridiculous to say that given the reality of the climate crisis, I mean, I realize that you don't think it's a real thing, but given the reality of the climate crisis, that fossil fuels are the best way to supply energy to the developing world. I mean, 8 million people a year die from the pollution of fossil fuels. Right now, we have incredibly cool technologies that allow us to gather sunlight and, concentrate it and make electricity. And then we can electrify so many of our technologies. I mean, maybe not flight, maybe not industrial heat yet, but again, that's where nuclear comes in. We can reduce our emissions 90% with everything we have right now. And we're not doing it because we want to keep fossil fuels in the mix so 8 million people can die. and we can make the climate crisis worse. Why? I don't get it at all.
And actually, it struck me kind of with great force more recently, that it's actually at the point where people are seeking for the grand narratives that we really fall down. I'll give you just one example of a grand narrative notion. Take back control. Take back control is a purely ideological notion. It has nearly no kind of practical application. It's a notion about the way things should be and the way in which the things you might kind of want to be, but it has no real practical application in the real world. It's a way of banishing the real world experience of people in favour of a bigger idea that somebody wants to cleave to. And my final argument, therefore, is that when you get those moments intruding upon real life, they almost invariably make life worse for everybody, and we could do without them.
I think we are feeling our way towards a new grand narrative, and the problem I see with that process is, given how disconnected we all are now, we are more plugged into the 50 people that we listen to on our phone than the people in this room. How we then in this room have something to unite around is very difficult to see, which is why one of the things I've been saying for a very long time is perhaps one of the things that we ought to do is go back, not in time, but in kind of the way we think about who we are. And the who we are is we are the product of Western civilization. There are some things that underpin that. We believe in freedom of expression, we believe in representative government, we believe in free market capitalism. And those are some of the things that underpin who we are. We then will have to deal with the technological changes and all sorts of other things that happen over time. In terms of the political side of it, I see on both the extreme left and the extreme right attempts to feel our way towards that. The right is clearly now moving in a Nietzschean direction, this sort of barbarian right of celebrating strength and disowning weakness. All of that is coming back. And on the left, it's very much the opposite movement, which is how can we make sure that we've taken care of literally everybody and equality of everybody.
How do we explain the excited character of doing harm that is fortified by the conviction that one is either doing good or, more messianically, restoring good to an ailing or imperiled world? What we know about passion is that it has a passive element, that it is an undergoing of something that seems to have an origin external to the self, and that it's either a temporary or an enduring state of feeling, of being, ungovernable. What then would make a passion or set of passions ungovernable? Well, if a heightened political discourse, like the anti-gender ideology movement, tells you that your life is being threatened, and if that is the case, then my guess is that you will tend to rise up against whatever it is that has been identified as a threat to your life. Well, that makes sense. But if that same authority or discourse tells you that the only way to keep your life, or perhaps your way of life, is to deny or destroy the rights of others, well, then you are, as it were, being conscripted into a war. You are told that your rights, your right to life, will be taken away from you by some people unless you move quickly to take away their rights, sometimes even their right to life. You are then fighting for the good at the same time that you are mobilizing your desire to destroy others, your long-standing resentments, or your newly incited forms of disdain. As you may know, the idea of gender has operated as an excitable concept in contemporary politics. Many political campaigns target gender as a destructive force and construe this phantasm of gender as a threat to national identity and the natural family. The Vatican has added to this discourse by likening gender to a nuclear bomb, the Ebola virus, the Hitler Youth. And when gender is figured as a threat to humanity, civilization, man, and nature, when gender is likened to a nuclear catastrophe or full-blown demonic power, then it is the fear of destruction to which political actors are appealing. The anti-gender movements stoke the fear that ordinary cis hetero people will be stripped of their status as mother, father, man, or woman, that words such as these will no longer be speakable, or others will have taken them over for nefarious purposes. But the call to deny the rights of trans people to their sex is reversed within the phantasmatic scenario, producing the idea that permitting such rights of self-definition will entail, logically or historically, becoming stripped of them for other people. Here, the political right shares a supposition with trans exclusionary feminists. Sex is a property to which one has exclusive rights, and any effort to challenge the property framework is a ruse of those seeking to steal or appropriate what is not rightfully their own. Throughout the anti-gender ideology movement, a morally righteous sadism has triumphed over the powers of capacious alliance or any commitment to cohabitation on the basis of equality. The only way out of this bind is to ally the struggle for gender freedoms and rights with a critique of capitalism, to formulate the freedoms for which we struggle as collective ones, and to let gender become part of a broader struggle for a social and economic world that eliminates precarity, provides health care, shelter, food across all regions, that opposes violence for all those who are vulnerable. Such an agenda would develop an understanding, I think, of the individual within the social world. We persist only to the extent that we are bound up with one another. So when we say, I want to be free, or I want you to be free, we are speaking, yes, about these distinct selves that we are, but also about social freedoms that should be accorded to everyone as long as no real harm is done. For that caveat to work, we have to expose the fear-mongering that would recast the claim to fundamental freedoms as harms and make freedom into a new and vital object of desire.
Some of you will remember the Tide Pod Challenge. So in the Tide Pod Challenge, young people would pop Tide Pods into their mouth. And this became quite a craze. There were articles about this. Teens are daring each other to eat Tide Pods. We don't need to tell you that's a bad idea. So Procter & Gamble, the multinational corporation that owns Tide, was extremely upset that people were using these products for food. And so they had this incredibly expensive ad campaign where they got famous people to tell the young people, stop eating Tide Pods. One was led by the athlete and popular figure, Gronk. So Gronk is asked in a YouTube video, hey Gronk, is eating Tide Pods ever a good idea? And Gronk says no. When these ads came up, consumptions of Tide Pods shot up remarkably. And it was only when Procter & Gamble had the good sense to shut up about it and stop telling people not to eat Tide Pods that gradually the craze went away. Now, I think the idea of perversity is in some way as an act of rebellion shows up all over the place. The story I began with is only the second most famous story of a perverse act involving fruit. The most famous, of course, is Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge. And doing, as many theologians have pointed out, doing the very one thing she was told not to. And this is a common instinct. We see this in real life, we see it in fiction. I'm a big fan of the TV series Better Call Saul. And in one of the pivotal episodes, our main character, Jimmy McGill, it looks like he's finally decided to go against his criminal life, his life of rebellion, his life of trouble. He gets hired by a prestigious law firm. This is the final scene of the final episode of a season. He's in a prestigious law firm, he's looking at his office, he's wandering around, and then he sees this sign, always leave on, do not turn off. And the episode ends with him peeling off the tape to get at the switch. Now this comes under different names. Self-governance, freedom, liberty, agency. But I see it basically as reflecting an urge for autonomy. That we want to be free, and if you just do what's rational, if you just do what's moral, what use are you? You could be replaced by an algorithm. To truly assert your independence, your autonomy, you have to rebel against these things. Maybe in small ways, maybe in big ways.
And then there are some people who say, as you said, oh yeah, I agree with your arguments, but I just love my steak too much. So, given that it's possible for humans to make that shift, then you couldn't say that it's impossible. But given that not everybody does it, even when they accept the arguments, you'd have to say that it's difficult, and whether we will get to the point of convincing the majority that morality extends to non-human animals and that the way that we treat animals, especially in industrial agriculture, in factory farms, is an abomination that we should not participate in. I don't really know, and it may be that we have to make those decisions easier to act on by providing the kinds of meat that people are used to eating and that they're used to cooking, either from plant-based ingredients or from cellular meat produced without going through any animal, just grown at the cellular level. Some people think that we need that to make it easier to make the transition. I can't really say for sure. I think it's an option. I'm still hopeful that we will get there simply through persuasive argument, but I can't say that I'm confident that will happen.
What to do? Would the two of you agree? Precisely because we people may be or may convince ourselves that are rational, but are not ready, as you nicely said. Yeah, I'm for animal rights, but don't disturb me while I'm eating my nice juicy steak. You know what maybe works? It's very naive. What about, here comes my Stalinist side, a well-organized, global as possible state propaganda where you simply inform people, but this should be put at the prime time on TV. For example, you eat pork, pigs, but are people aware of the horror reality of the daily lives of pigs grown to be slaughtered, who are half blind, cannot even walk? The same goes with chicken. Or my favorite terrifying example, maybe you know the name, isn't now some special coffee made mostly in Indonesia? Some apes, I don't know the name, are compelled, forced to eat, it's literally we eat sheep, to eat coffee beans, and then sheet, becoming part of sheet, made them to taste, don't ask me why, excellently. People can be convinced with good, disgusting examples.
Can a phone-based childhood be generally healthy? As kids have moved from a play-based childhood, and nobody disputes that kids used to spend a lot of time playing and independent, and in about 2010 to 2015, a very, very short matter of time, smartphones with social media and high-speed internet moved to the center of kids' lives. In 2010, the millennials were using flip phones. Their mental health was fine. In 2015, Gen Z was using smartphones, social media, especially Instagram, front-facing camera, and their mental health collapsed. I mean, it plummeted like nothing we have ever seen. We've never seen anything so fast. So I'd like to propose that at least part of what we're thinking about is, can there be a safe and effective form of a phone-based childhood where kids are spending 10 to 15 hours a day on their phone or other screens? And I think the answer is no. The fact that educational attainment in the United States has been going up and up and up since the early 70s, slow but steady. Early 70s, yes, it went down during COVID, but the decline started after 2012. We're going up and up. They start going down. The PISA data set around the world, human children are getting less intelligent, or at least they know less. That has not happened before. So what we are witnessing is, I think, the largest destruction of human capital and human potential in human history, leaving aside the 2 world wars. In terms of destroying children's opportunities and knowledge and ability to focus, ability to do anything, there's never been anything like this.
These are the kinds of messaging that causes absolute panic in parents and does not result in effective parenting. And so what I want to be here to do is balance this out. I am a therapist. I work with kids and teenagers and families. I parent my own 3 children. I regularly interact with kids and teens and families, and it is not this doom and gloom. There aren't rapists on every corner. And I think we just need to tone that down a little bit, because we need to be less absolutist, okay? More nuanced in this discussion. There are some kids who struggle more and who it does not serve a healthy function for. There are other kids, and data backs this up, that are fine.
Emily says that this kind of messaging is causing panic. in past moral panics, that's been true. The media is fueling the story that kids are reading comic books and then they're killing their mothers, and that didn't happen. That's not what's going on this time. This time, everyone has seen it in their own kids or in other kids they know. I can't tell you how many interviews I've done where the journalist, before the camera starts rolling, the journalist says, I've seen it in my own kids. This is not a media-induced panic. Parents have been panicked about this for a long time because they see it. Since 2012, they see it. And what's happening is that since my book came out and I explained the collective action problem, that was the thing. Everyone felt they couldn't do anything. They were hopeless. Now they're not panicked and fearful and resigned. It's the opposite. All over the world now, in the last few months, parents are coming together saying, yes, let's do collective action. Let's get our kids together after school. Let's push the school to go phone free. I have never seen so much hope. I have never seen so much quick change, progress, working together. This is not a story about panic. This is a story about, here's what's been happening to our kids. Here's the way out. Let's do it. And we're doing it.
These anecdotes are very compelling and very strong, and they're not capturing the whole picture. So the extreme language, I just want to point out, we're not all thinking that way.
Oh, well, Emily is saying it doesn't affect everyone. Sure, that's true. Even if it didn't affect a majority, it would still be the biggest crisis we could possibly face for our kids for this reason. I recently found out in the US, we give warning labels on toys that have small parts, a choking hazard, or that have a string. Do you know how many people choke to death in America every year? About a dozen. Look at TikTok. TikTok has the choking challenge. I can't get exact numbers, but it's something like 20 or 30 documented cases of kids who've choked themselves to death just from TikTok, one TikTok challenge. So we don't say, oh, well, most kids aren't choking to death, therefore it's okay. We say, wait a second. If dozens of kids are choking to death from this consumer product, we pull it from the market. If it's a defective product harming children, we pull it from the market. And the death toll from TikTok is not just a few dozen. It's hundreds and hundreds if you include the suicide promotion stuff. Just sextortion, as Catherine was saying, once you give your kid a phone, they're going to be in contact with men all over the world and with sextortion rings that are going to try to get naked photos, and especially if they're boys. When a boy sends a nude photo of himself to what he thinks is a girl, and then a sextortion ring says, oh, we got you now. We know all your friends. We're going to shame you unless you give us money. And then he gives them money to say, we need more. And then he kills himself. That's not mistaking correlation for causation. That is, social media caused the death of this child. It wouldn't have happened if it wasn't on social media. And even if this was only happening to a few hundred kids a year, it's a lot more than that. But even if we had only a few hundred suicides a year from social media, it would be worth a Surgeon General warning. It's so much worse than any consumer product we show our kids. Now, is social media responsible for the huge increase that I've been saying? There's an academic debate about that. Some people say I'm wrong. I think Emily would say no, social media didn't cause the big increase. But let's bear in mind, the big increase we're talking about is not about a few hundred kids. It's about a few 100 million kids. And so what we're dealing with here is the possibility that a few companies, primarily Meta and TikTok and Snap, that a few companies have at least damaged the mental health of hundreds of millions of children and led to thousands of additional suicides. So yeah, it's not most people, even if most kids are fine. Are you going to let your kid use a product that's going to double or triple their chance of depression and their chance of suicide? I can't believe we're even having this argument this late in the game. I was reading one of Emily's essays. She says, the genie is out of the bottle. We can't shove it back in. And she says, we need to raise our children for the world we have, not the world we wish we had. And I very strongly disagree with that. The world we have is one which is unbelievably toxic for human development. It's completely out of whack with the way we evolved for childhood. It is unsustainable. We can't lose another year of children, in my opinion. So we have to actually bring into being a world that we want.
A lot of people go into a romantic relationship because I think it's the only option, really. Like, if they don't, they're gonna have a harder time finding an apartment, having kids, being respected, being seen as a grown-up. And so a lot of people go into this relationship because I don't think that being single is possible. But also, they stay in a relationship even if they're unhappy, which can happen for many reasons. The less, I was going to say lethal, but it's just that we're in a society where we are taught to care about, put ourselves first and look for our own happiness. But in a relationship, you have to compromise. And so we're at a time where just being in a relationship is not really working with what we're looking for ourselves. And then you got the injustice, like the inequalities of women are still doing all the work at home. Okay, not all the work, but like you look at the stats, it's not that far from that. The violence, you can die in a straight romantic relationship. And if you don't have the option to leave those relationships, if being single is not accepted, then you cannot leave those dangerous relationships.
Some of the most worthwhile things ever done have been done by single people. But all else being equal, in the statistics at a national level, you will be happier. So I don't know if you remember David Cameron's happiness index that he launched in about 2011. Do you remember that, going back a bit?
I wish I did.
They still collect that. The ONS still collect that data. It's still there. You can go and have a look at it. And they rank the various factors that make people support reports sort of find themselves whether they are satisfied with their life. And the top thing is whether you are physically healthy. If you are really physically healthy, that's probably going to show you have good life satisfaction. The bottom on the list is actually income, which we always think is the main thing. The second thing on the list is being married. That there are absolutely terrible marriages. There are abusive marriages that people should run away from. There are awful relationships. But the problem is our marriage rate has collapsed, and many of those marriages that didn't happen would have been supportive, healthy, wonderful relationships. And it's interesting, we talked a bit about sort of romance and I sort of agree with you about we've sort of created this romance around marriage, that this Disney princess feel of marriage. It's not about that, it's about commitment. We've stopped committing. It's about saying, I'm going to make a line in the sand where I commit to this person. And funnily enough, the data shows if you put a line in the sand and say, I am committed, you are more likely to be committed.
The thing is, we need to commit to long-term relationships. But again, long-term relationships, they're not necessarily romantic relationships. If we stop thinking of romantic relationships as the only relationships, then we could actually have a discussion about friendship. And do we want to rely only on one person that is supposed to be everything for us? Or economic partner, or well-being partner, or parenting partner? All of that in once? I mean, I wouldn't put all of my eggs in the same basket. I don't think it's too much pressure on the couple. It's probably going to be a bad bet. And then when you divorce, you're going to probably find yourself with even less than you had before you got married. Because oftentimes we see the stats, since you love talking about numbers, people lose friends when they're married.